Hey guys, in this video I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about webhooks and how you can use them to build powerful automations on n8n. Let's get into it. So the idea of a webhook is to get an external application to send you a request or just send you data once a specific event happens inside that application. And so it's actually happening on that external application as opposed to it being initiated from your end to that external application. And the reason why a webhook is extremely important inside an automation is that we will use it to trigger the automations, right? Because when we set out an automation, the automation needs to know when it should run. Some event should happen to tell this automation, hey, it's time for you to run. And having webhooks allows us to hook into events that happen on external applications. So for example, once we receive a new email on Gmail, this is an event that happens in an external application to n8n, which is on Gmail. But we know because we've set up the webhook, Gmail is going to let us know once this event happens, and that will trigger our automation. And so webhooks are really important because they allow for us to trigger the automation based off events that happen external to the actual automation itself. On the other hand, API requests allow for us to take actions inside the actual automation. So if this is the automation, the trigger is going to happen via the webhook. And then at some point inside there, if we want to communicate with an external application, we'll send over an API request and then get some data and then use that data to achieve the actual objective that we have. And when it comes to webhooks, n8n actually has native integrations with certain applications that make it easier for you to communicate with them via webhooks, similar to how we had it inside the actual HTTP request nodes. So let's say, for example, in this case, we want to get a notification when someone creates a new task on Asana. So I've just created a fake Asana account for myself just for the sake of this demo. And the goal is that anytime someone creates a new task inside this specific project, n8n Masterclass, I will get a notification inside n8n, which will run the automation or which will trigger the automation. And to do this, we've set up a Asana trigger node using the native integration we have with Asana. And then what we have to do is we have to connect ourselves to Asana. Because similar to an API request, you still have to have a way to keep the connection secure. You don't want that application to send over data to just anyone. You don't want it to be public. And so you have to have a way of making sure that only you receive the information from Asana once that event actually happens inside Asana. And connecting yourself to Asana's webhook is literally so easy. All you have to do is click on create new credential and you have to just sign in to Asana. And then literally as easy as that, you would have connected yourself to Asana's webhook and then you just want to name it. Let's say n8n Masterclass Asana webhook. Boom. Save that and then we'll come out of it. And literally now you can see that we have these two parameters that we can fill out. Number one, it says exactly what resource are we trying to tap into via the webhook. And the second one is saying what workspace name. So the workspace name, let's just say my workspace because I haven't actually set up that Asana account. It's just a random one for the sake of this demo. And then it wants me to define the exact resource that we want to track inside Asana. And so as I said, we want to track this specific project. So we'll just grab the ID of this project, which is this one here. We'll come back and then we will paste it in. And so just like that, what should technically happen is we should be listening to events that happen inside Asana, specifically inside the n8n Masterclass project. And as I said, because n8n has a native integration with Asana, it's actually been abstracted for us to a certain level, and connecting yourself and choosing the resources is a lot easier. You don't have to do it using JSON and all the other stuff that we talked about inside HTTP request nodes. So when it comes to setting up webhooks, you have to also set up a URL. You know how when we're talking about the APIs, we said, if we have an application here, and if we have an application here, and this application is trying to send an API request over to this application, it has to say exactly where that application sits and what it wants to do within that application. And to do that, it has to define the exact URL along with the endpoints inside that specific application. And because now you've defined the URL, similar to how you would define it for us when we use our Google Chrome browser, the application would know exactly where it's sending that data to reach that specific app. And now in the case of a webhook, because as I said, a webhook is a reverse API, it's actually that application wanting to send us some data. And for that application to know where we are, we have to give it a URL that it will go to send over that data. So the same thing as an API, but just in reverse, with that application sending us data. And for that, we have to define the exact URL and the URL will be given to you by n8n. So n8n will give you access to two URLs. The first one is a test URL and the second one is a production URL. Now, when you're still building out your flow and you haven't actually activated your flow, what you'd do is you'd be using the test URL. And to test that URL, you have to click on execute step, and then it will start listening for events that happen inside that external application. But when you haven't clicked on execute step, it wouldn't be listening to it because you haven't actually activated or turned on your automation for it to run automatically in the backend. But then once you've built out your workflow and you're ready to go, you will just activate the workflow, and then you'll come here and you'll make sure that you give the production URL to that application. So let's say if we're talking to Asana, you want to make sure that Asana has access to your production URL. So even when you're not actually on n8n, if that specific event happens inside Asana, it will let you know by going to this production URL and triggering the automation inside n8n. And so just to summarize that, when you're still building out the flow, use test URLs and execute it. When you've fully built out the flow, use the production URL and activate the workflow so it will run in the backend without you having to do anything whatsoever. So let's just test this to make sure that the webhook's actually working. I'm just going to click on execute step so it starts listening. And then I'm going to go to Asana. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete a task. Let's just delete the one that says create new example. So we'll double click that and then we'll delete the task. So as you guys can see on n8n, now we received an output from that trigger node or from that webhook trigger node. As you can see, the output says that the action that was taken was deleting a task. And that's perfect because it means that Asana actually sent over that data to n8n by itself. And it told n8n that we deleted a task. And so technically, if I wanted to build this in a flow, I could just add a Gmail node next to it and send the message to myself, and I can pull in that specific action. So if I were to run this, you can see it sends an email to me, and inside the email, it says task deleted, task was deleted. And so technically, if I were to turn this on and let it run in the backend, what will happen is every time someone deletes a task or creates a task or does whatever inside Asana, my webhook trigger node will trigger the automation. It will grab the info from Asana, pass it on to whatever I have in the automation, or in this case, it will pass it on to Gmail, and then Gmail will send me an email saying the task was whatever happened, in this case deleted, and the task was whatever happened, in this case deleted. And as you can see, that's exactly what we received inside our email. And that's just one example of why you would use a webhook trigger node. There's a gazillion examples you can think of. One of the main ones is, for example, if someone sends you a payment, you would want Stripe to let you know. Another one would be if you want Calendly to let you know when someone books a call with you on your calendar. Another one could be Typeform letting you know that someone completed a form, like maybe a new lead completed a form or something like that. And so there's a lot of examples that you can think of where you would want to know when an event happens in an external application, and you'd want that event to then trigger your automation for something to happen in the backend, right? Whether that's sending yourself an email or whether that's grabbing the details of that lead to reach out to them, or whether that's calling them, messaging them, adding them to your CRM, or whatever it's going to be. So knowing how to work your way around webhook trigger nodes is extremely important. But in this instance, we looked at Asana, which obviously n8n had made our lives easy by giving us a native integration. But you're not always going to have a native integration. In scenarios where you don't have a native integration, what you'd want to do is you'd want to use what we call the webhook trigger node. So if you just go to add node, go to trigger, you can see that the webhook trigger node is this one that says on webhook call. So you'd click it. And then as you can see, the webhook trigger node is a little bit more ugly because it doesn't have everything extracted depending on the application. It's giving us access to all the points that we have to add to that webhook trigger, similar to how we had inside the HTTP request node. So inside the webhook trigger node, you have to define a couple of things. The first thing you have to define is what type of API request or what type of request will be sent from that external application. So if this is the app and this is n8n, you have to first define what type of request you want the app to send over to n8n. Do you want it to be a GET request? Do you want it to be a POST request? Do you want it to be a PUT request, a PATCH request, or a delete or head? Now, in most instances, you want that application to actually send over some data to n8n because something happened inside that application. Whether that's an email, whether that's a new contact, whether that's a new form, or whatever it's going to be. And so in most cases, what you end up using is a POST request inside your webhook. So you're basically saying the way for the external application to talk to me inside this specific URL is to send over a POST request. So you define for it to be POST. And now I hope you guys can see how it's basically you building out the API documentation for your own application. So you know how when we were using GoHighLevel and we were trying to figure out how we communicate with the API, we had to see what each endpoint required. Like for example, creating a contact required for us to send a post request, this URL with these specific parameters. Same sort of deal here, but just the opposite way around. As I said, webhook, reverse API. You define how that application should communicate with you once an event actually happens. So you first define what the HTTP method is. In this case, let's say post, and then you have to define exactly what the endpoint of that URL is. So if we have a look at the URL is usually equivalent to your actual cloud hosted URL. And then it would have a / webhook test or production, depending on if you're on test or production. And then it would have / and the actual endpoint or the path that you want to send to. So you can actually define that down here. If I wanted to, I can put a / and say link / 1 2 3 4 5, whatever it is, right? I could define the exact endpoint inside the path parameter. And then you can use authentication to basically make sure that that application has to actually authenticate itself when it wants to send data over to n8n. And it's just a way for you to make sure that your connections are safe. And it's not just a public URL anyone can use and send data through, which is obviously not amazing when it comes to safety. And so when it comes to setting up an authentication, you can either do a basic, header, JWT, or just none. If it's just an internal project I'm building for myself, sometimes I just do none because it's almost impossible for people to know what the actual path is. So it'd be very hard for them to find my actual URL if they didn't have access to my account. But if I'm building out something for a client, I'd usually use some sort of authentication to make sure that it's a secure connection. And then you can define whether you want to respond immediately or whether you want to respond later. And what this basically means, right, is as I said, in an API request, you'd have the external app and then you'd have n8n. So generally when an API request is sent over, so a request is sent over, you would actually get a response back. And how we saw this when we did API requests inside the HTTP request node was that we had the inputs on the left that was sent over to this application via API. And then we had the output, which is what the application responded to us with. And that's the response of our API request from that application. Now, since the API request is being made from the external application to n8n, you can define what and how and when you want to respond to that application. So if you click on immediately, what would happen is the external application will get a response immediately. So once it sends over the request, it will immediately get a response saying, hey, all good, thank you, received it. Otherwise, in some instances, if you want to do a certain number of things before you respond, you can say wait until the last node finishes. This just means once the request comes in, so once the automation is triggered, wait until the entire automation runs. And then at the very end, once the last node is also ran, so the automation completed, then respond back to the app saying, hey, thank you, with whatever details you want to define. So you can actually define what type of data you want to send over in the response of that API request. But the one that I also like is using respond to webhook node. And that basically is just another node that we have. If we search up webhook, you can see there's one that's called respond to webhook. And that actually gives you the flexibility of defining exactly what data you want to send back inside that response. So sometimes you just want to redirect them to another URL. And that's actually what I do for a lot of my webhooks, because I use webhooks when I want to add unsubscribe links to my emails. There we go, unsub link. And if you guys have been following the videos and if you're inside the community, I'm sure you've seen the cold email automation that we built out directly into GHL. And the idea is that we want to be able to track when people click the unsubscribe link. So the unsubscribe link is actually a webhook. And then once people click that webhook, it sends over a request to us saying, hey, someone clicked the webhook with whatever information. And then we will grab that information and then we'll redirect them to a URL that says, hey, thank you for unsubscribing. We've now removed you from our email list. So if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. Just go and watch the cold email video and it'll make perfect sense to you. But the idea is that the webhook will listen for the request to come in to n8n. And then at the very end, you will send off a response back to the application. So just to show you guys an example, I'm going to build out a webhook that's going to listen to GoHighLevel so that when on GoHighLevel, a new tag is connected to a contact inside the CRM, GoHighLevel will trigger our automation inside n8n. So a tag being added to a contact will trigger an n8n workflow to do something with that tag or with that contact. Now, the reason why I love GoHighLevel is that it actually allows you to build workflows inside GoHighLevel as well. So when you combine the capabilities of GoHighLevel, having access to almost every single marketing channel that you would use, plus the ability to build out simple workflows inside GoHighLevel, and then when you combine that with the ability to send data over to n8n to do even more things, you literally have the ultimate combination of applications to build out crazy useful business automations. And that's why I gave you guys all access to a GoHighLevel account inside the community. All right, so let's take a look. We've created a new automation on GoHighLevel that's triggering anytime a tag is added to a contact. And the tag that we're interested in is the n8n masterclass tag. So if I go on any of the contacts right now and I add this tag, it should trigger this automation. And now what we want to do is that we want to tell GoHighLevel to send that data over to n8n once this event actually happens. And to do that in GoHighLevel, what we can do is we can set up a webhook node. So we just go to webhook, and then we have to define exactly what request we're sending to which URL. So to set that side of things up, you go back to n8n, you click on add node, add another trigger, and you search up webhook. So that gives you access to the standard webhook trigger node. And then as you can see, we have to actually set up the URL along with all the details of that request that needs to be sent from GoHighLevel. So to do that, the first thing we'll do is we'll define what type of method we're trying to use. So considering the fact that GoHighLevel is going to be sending us data about that contact, like the contact's name and email address, we want to make sure that it's going to be a post request. So this will change to post. And then with the path, let's just add GHL/n8n masterclass. So that's the exact URL that it would be sending to. So that's perfect. And then we want to set up an authentication just to make sure we're secure. So we'll make it a header authentication, and we'll create a new credential, and we'll call this one authorization, and we'll give it the value bearer 12345. Now you can put whatever value you want as the password of this authentication. So we'll name this one n8n masterclass GHL webhook example. I know it's a super long name, but I just want to make sure it's descriptive. There we go, we'll save that. But then what we want to do is want to replicate this exact username, password, or key and value inside GoHighLevel. So we'll come back to GoHighLevel. We'll go over to headers and we'll add a new header because we want to authorize ourselves inside the HTTP request. So similar to how we were doing it inside an API request, where we had to authorize ourselves when we wanted to talk to that external application, we're just doing the same thing, but this time from the external application to n8n. So we know that we've defined a header authorization from n8n, and we've named the key authorization. And then for the value, we had bearer space 12345 There you go. We don't need to send any more headers, so we'll leave that as it is for now. And then we can cross out of this. So then it's saying, okay, do you want to respond to GoHighLevel immediately? Do you want to respond when the last node finishes or through the respond to webhook node? We'll just respond immediately because it doesn't really make sense to do any other ones. Now we just have to grab this specific URL. So we'll actually try the production URL. We'll click on that. That will copy it to clipboard. We'll go back to GoHighLevel. We'll paste in the exact URL with that specific endpoint, GHL n8n masterclass. There you go. So it's also a post request. We'll just make sure that this is on post, which is perfect. And then we want to define exactly what data we want to send through. So GoHighLevel actually will send out all the data that's coming from the previous node, but it will also allow for us to define custom data if we want to keep it deterministic every single time. So the two things that I really care about is name and email address. So I'm just going to say the name is contact full name and the email address is contact email. So just like that, GoHighLevel should be well equipped to send over a post request to this URL with these details and this password anytime that specific trigger happens inside GoHighLevel. This is literally so powerful. So once you guys get to building out cool custom workflows for yourself or for other businesses, you'll see just how powerful this combination actually is. So I'm just going to save that to make sure it's actually working. And then I'm just going to save this as well. And I've also made sure that the workflow is active, so I don't have to actually physically be on n8n. I can just go about my life and the automation will happen in the backend and it will be triggered and everything will happen once the event happens inside GoHighLevel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to test this out by going to my contacts and adding that tag to a specific contact. So let's just say we have this specific contact called Kia Testing and the email address is kia.demobot@gmail.com. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom and I'm just going to add a new tag. I'm going to say n8n masterclass. And then just like that, without me having to do anything else, if I come over to n8n and go to executions, I should see that there is a recent execution from GoHighLevel sending us that specific information. So if I go to executions, you can see that we do indeed have a green tick on that webhook node. And inside it, we can see that there is a bunch of data that's been sent over to us from GoHighLevel. And the reason why we know this is actually from the test that we just ran on GoHighLevel is that the name of the contact is Kia Testing, which is the one that we just used. And the email address is kia.mlbot@gmail.com. And so this means that literally without us having to do anything, just by something changing on GoHighLevel, GoHighLevel sent that information over to n8n and triggered an automation. Now we haven't actually built out this automation yet, so there's nothing really happening after the webhook trigger node. But what we can do now is we can add a Gmail node and we can send this to ourselves via an email. So I can say new contact tagged, turn into an expression. Name is this name here. Email is this email here. And I'll say new contact tagged GHL. To who are we sending it to? Let's just send it to ourselves again. There we go. And that's literally all. So if I just go back and save this, what should happen is if I come back to GHL and I change this name to ABCDEFG, and if I change the email to abcd@gmail.com and I save that, what I can technically do is go all the way to the bottom, remove that tag, and then add it again, and expect that just like that, I should receive an email with details of this specific contact being tagged. So if I go back to my email address and I refresh, you can see that we have a new email saying new contact tagged GHL, name, ABCDEFG testing, and email, this email here. So I hope you can see just how powerful being able to use webhooks actually is inside n8n. And when you combine that with the capabilities of GHL, the possibilities are literally endless.